So through the concept of setting up your authentication config, you look at the web config. Now, the web config is the web version of the .NET convention for all application configs. So if you're building a command line or a Windows application, your project comes with an app.config file. So that's where you put things like application setting, parameters, connection strings, any other types of customizations that you want to make to the framework from a non-compiled level. So anything that you want to make that can be manipulated or changed. So if you're dealing with WCF, you can go in and actually set up your bindings and your socket points and your endpoints and all of the services, and you wire all that up within this web config so that it's malleable, so that you can manipulate it without having to recompile. And you setting up things like SMTP servers, so if you're sending mail out, you can do all of that within the config file. So again, it's not compiled into your application and it's somewhat malleable. There are arguments that better options are storing it in a database. I don't disagree with that. But then you have to set up all the management ends to make all that happen unless you're manipulating the database directly. So this was Microsoft's answer to framework-specific customizations without hard coding it inside the app. The websites have web.config files for that same purpose. Now, within here, we have a lot of different sections, and I won't go through all of them, but I'll just highlight the ones that are of importance. So connection string, obviously, we've dealt with that in the past. That's where you store your connection string for your entity framework or ADO.NET configs. App settings is a place where you can basically store standard string key value pairs. So if you want to store like a debugger URL, you can make a add key debugger URL value some email address or some website address where you want to post debug information. Those are pretty standard for any app. Beyond that, you start to get into specific or custom elements, specifically under system.web. Anything that is under the system.web namespace can be managed or configured underneath this element. So you have things like the HTTP runtime target framework. We're running on .NET 4.5. This compilation, so if there is any runtime compiling that needs to be done with not the C# code, but any compiling that needs to be done at runtime with your CSHTML files or ASPX files if we were doing web forms, this determines what type of compiling that should be done. Should it compile for debug? If you remove that attribute, it will compile for release, so you'll get more optimized code without debug symbols. And then again, the target framework is 4.5. Pages, this allows you to kind of pump like namespaces for references and other page-specific elements like themes and things like that can all be pumped through the pages element. Then you get into things like profiles and memberships and role managers, session state. These are all for different components. So profiles, memberships, and role managers has to do with the pre-built authentication, membership authentication that's built into ASP.NET. We're not going to actually touch those. That's for the quick deploy scenario where you need to spin up an app real fast and you just want Visual Studio and Microsoft to kind of just pre-build something for you. They make your tables, they have these pre-built role providers, and basically it just all falls together and works. It's the black box of rapid development, which works great as long as you know that you're falling into that black box of rapid development and you're hoping you never have to customize it. Session state, that's something I won't get into it right now, but session state and session state configuration is actually something that's very important because it has to do with how does ASP.NET manage the per user session information. When you're running on a single web server, the in-proc mode basically means that the process that's running on the web server carves out a section of space for session data. Session IDs, session variables, which we used, I believe it was last week or 2 weeks ago, where we actually stored our cart in the session. The session state talks about how is that data serialized. Where is it stored? Is it stored in process with the actual web application when it's running? There's other options. You can serialize to a SQL server, so it'll actually create tables and store all that session data in tables. so that if you're running in a web farm environment, then you have multiple app servers that are running, but they all need to hit the same session data because the request may go to server 1 the first time, the page loads, and the next request goes to server 2, so they need to stay in sync. A third option is that there's a process that's installed that's called state server. It's a process that's on almost every machine if you do the full install of Windows. And it's set to manual by default. If you enable that and change your mode to state server, and I'm not sure if that's the exact attribute, but you can look it up, what that does is it then spins up an alternate or independent process for managing and maintaining state. Again, in a web farm environment, that's a good element to use because then your state is now independent of the process that's running under. What are other applications for this? If you have a very, now obviously there's other problems here, but fundamentally if you have a very volatile web application where maybe it's plugin based, where when you deploy a new plugin, it actually spins up a new instance of the application pool for your app. And we haven't gotten into all the details of IIS, but your application runs inside of IIS, Internet Information Server for Windows. Inside of that is what's called an app pool, and inside of that app pool is the carved out process that your website runs under. Well, when those app pools terminate, the session data is lost. So if you have a case where you deploy new code on a regular basis, you can actually end up destroying and building new processes every time. When you do that, if someone's in the middle of, say, shopping, and your shopping cart's stored in the session variable, the moment that that process restarts, that shopping cart gets blown away. So the session state service allows you to move that out of process. So the session state service actually stores the session data, and then if that app pool gets restarted, you don't lose the session data because it's in a separate process. So it comes on pretty much every machine that I've seen that has the full framework install. Not the client profile, but the full framework, you get the session state service. It can run on the same machine, but it spins up as a separate process so that you end up with that independence of session state. That's all managed through that mode. But the reason I jumped in here, the thing I wanted to focus on specifically, is the authentication element. And I'm actually going to go ahead and web config authentication. Nope, that one. And I just want to make you aware of the different modes and options. So under authentication, you basically come down to 4 modes. No authentication, none. Windows authentication, which is a similar mode to what's called digest authentication, which basically means that when somebody comes to a web page, if it's an intranet page specifically, it will attempt to capture the person who's logged into the machine. And you may not know this, but Internet Explorer and Chrome will actually take the user's token information, their profile token information, whoever's logged into the machine, and it passes it to the web page if it's an intranet page. So you can passively authenticate somebody based on the credentials that the machine pushes to the browser. And then you hit that against an Active Directory server and you just say, oh, you are so-and-so. And you just authenticate them. So that's what the Windows authentication does. If it can't digest the authentication or digest the credentials, then what it will do is it will then force one of those browser-style pop-up boxes to log in. And then you put in your username and password for your network, and then it'll authenticate you that way. Passport authentication, which I'll be honest, I've never heard of anyone actually using it, was Microsoft Passport, which then became Microsoft, I guess now it's Live ID. I think there was something in between there, but that's what they call it now. I've never heard of anyone using it. but it is there. It's part of the framework as they were going through trying to build all this stuff. And then the one that's the most common, which is your forms authentication, which is basically web-based authentication. Username password field, like you see on almost every site, a button to log in, it posts the data back to the server, and then the server handles that authentication management of the user. So that's the mode that we're going to take. Beyond that, you have child elements. There's a forms element, and then there's a passport element. We're going to use the forms element, and then kind of just talk through these different forms pieces. So, make sure I'm covering everything. Okay. So, the forms element, you can do more with it, but at a very simplistic sense, it's there to do one thing and one thing only. It says, where does the login page live, and how long should a person stay logged in? Okay? Beyond that, you're not really doing a whole lot in this space. You're saying, where's the login page for them to log in, and how long should they be logged in? You can go one step further with, okay, that's what I thought. You can go one step further, and you can actually put inside of here credentials. Now this is the method I don't recommend using. But if you need to get it done quick and dirty, for whatever reason, you can do it this way. So if you have a system where you just need to hard code some credentials into it, you can store them inside the web config, and then your forms authentication by default, there's certain methods that you can use within the framework that will grab these credentials out and then log a person in. Quick, simple, nothing fancy. Obviously the passwords are clear text, so that's a concern. If anybody has access to this, they can basically steal all your credentials. Point to note is that the web config file is protected by the framework and by IAS. So if you try to navigate to that page, it will basically it either gives you some sort of an error saying that you're not allowed to browse that page, or I think the newer releases, they don't even respond. They give you a 404 saying the file's not found. So it's protected from the outside, but if someone gets into your server, obviously, and your username and passwords are in there, you're done. The other thing is that only users can be added by going into the web config and adding them here. So you're kind of in this small box when it comes to management of the system. All right, so that's the config. In the most simplistic sense, that's the config for authentication. So how do we actually force authentication? If we go back into our controllers, go back to product admin controller. So this is the controller we built last week. I always do that. And I'm just going to go to the index. You can do authorize. It's an attribute. And it also takes additional things like order, roles, and users. So if you want to lock this down and say only people with this role or only these users, you can do that type of work here. But let's just keep it simple and say that they must be authenticated to hit that. We can also move this attribute up to the class level. And what that means is that you're not allowed to call this controller unless you're authorized or authenticated. So we'll compile and run. So this is our default product view. So we'll go product admin / index. Oh, right. All right. So we need, all right, so what happened is we hit that page. It redirected us to /account/login. And we don't have an account or an account controller. We don't have a login action, so we need to create one of those. So let's stop real fast. We'll go in, controllers, add controller, account. We'll make it an empty MVC controller. And we'll whack that, and then we'll say public action results login. And then we'll actually need a second action result. Login. And this will take username and string password. So we'll go ahead and add a view. We'll use our default layout. So then in here we'll do field set, legend, login. And then I'm just going to kind of do the shorthand, input, type text, name, username, label, username, for username, ID, username. Input type, submit. I forgot using, I'm sorry, how do I spoof this? That was begin form, no. Thank you. Return view, return redirect, authentication, validate user, create auth cookie, redirect to page, whatever. Alright. Alright, so this will generate our login page. Simple, username, password, nothing fancy. And then on postback, we're going to expect username and password as parameters coming from those text boxes. So then inside of here, we're going to use a series of methods that live in the system.web.security namespace. And they live all off of forms authentication class. So we'll just call this auth. And then we can do an if statement. We'll say if auth dot, oh, I'm sorry, I do that all the time. I always want to create instances of utility classes. So forms auth dot authenticate, and it'll be username and password. So if the user is authenticated, then forms authentication dot set auth cookie, which we can then pass in the username. And if we want the authentication to be stored in a cookie, which means that it'll persist even after the browser is closed and relaunched, then we set this to true. If we only want them to be logged in until the browser sessions are closed, then we set it to false. So, and that's the default case in most instances. But we need to capture one thing. String redirect URL. So we'll call forms authentication. Get redirect URL. What was that? Is it the model validation? Okay. I just skipped over that. Model that is valid. You're talking about in the book? What? Are you sure you're okay?
I thought the is valid method was 30 hours didn't quite seem simple. Well,
It's okay. Okay. So, redirect URL. Oh, okay. You guys okay? Okay. I'm just making sure I didn't want to get ahead of you. False. So this is something that's always kind of annoyed me. I know probably shouldn't be saying this, but with the forms authentication class, you have all these different modes of, like you have get redirect URL, which if you go back here, you'll notice that it says return URL equals %2 products or product admin %2 index or %2f. I'm sorry. %2f is the URL encoding for the slash, and basically all that's saying is slash product admin slash index is where you should return to after you authenticate. So in order to capture that, there's this get redirect URL method. That method requires that you pass the username and whether or not to persist the authentication in a cookie. And the part that's funny is if you just call forms authentication set auth cookie, it's the same parameters. So by calling get redirect URL, you're basically doing this call. It's part of the call. That's why you have to pass the same parameters. But to me, it just always seemed very out of sorts because it's like, well, what if I just want to get the URL, but I don't want to authenticate them? So that's me, I guess. So last step is to redirect. I've got extra curly brackets. Doesn't like that. String. F6. No. F6. Okay. All right. So if we back this up and go product admin / index, it should then
Green line on here.
is ambiguous.
Get a green line on here.
Oh, it's because it's an obsolete method. It wants me to use the membership APIs instead. It doesn't know which one of these methods to use. So I'll make that a post. So this will be login on account. The form method will be a post. So if I launch it again, so I missed the using. So that was my mistake. I forgot to put the using around HTML.begin form. So that generates our, let me put a line break here. Refresh. Alright. So looking at the HTML of this, you have form action account / login, method post, with the label, the input box, label, input box, and then the submit button out there. Put another line break here. Alright. Now, so this, we type in Kevin password 2. Oh, hang on. Password. Kevin password 2. And if we debug on IS Express, that's not what I want. Put a breakpoint here. Submit. We fall into that action method with the username and the password. And I've got a logic issue here, I just realized. So I don't want to redirect if I don't actually get.
Well, you can do it regardless, right?
Well, I guess I could, and I'm redirecting with an empty string, so it'll just return back to itself. But there's no information being passed back to the view to say, hey, this was a bad login. It just will redirect back to itself. So if we break through this, authenticate, username and password, oh, it returned false. No, it cannot be null. So let me do this, else. So we'll return view here. And this should be return redirect. And this should be our redirect URL. So now the bigger question is, why did it fail? F6. I'm pretty sure it was Kevin and password 2. That's correct. What did I miss? anybody see what I'm missing?
You said redirect to no.
Huh?
Said redirect URL to no.
Set it to no. Set it to null. Well, no, the problem is that this is never getting... Right, so, alright, so let's go back and I'll run through it again. Oh, wait, Kevin, password 2, right? So there's Kevin. There's password 2. Okay. So what should happen is I should pass these in, Kevin, password 2. This should be using these credentials. But instead it fails. If it returns true, then the if statement is, takes it and takes that whole result set and says true. Right. Right. So I could say is true. Right. Yeah. So think of the if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. I mean, that's basically what I'm doing. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. Actually, let me bring this back up. Blah, blah, blah. Forms, login, protection. I wonder if that's my issue. My password format needs to be... clear. Did he do that in the book? Ah, he did. I bet that's what it was. Yeah, so I wonder if it assumed it was a hash value. So, let me go back and make that statement. Alright, so you can have different password formats for these credentials. So you don't have to store clear text, you can store SHA1 or MD5. So the idea is that you would have to hash the password and then store the hash instead of storing the clear text. In our case, we're storing the clear text. I guess clear text is not the default.